Thank you very much. The second session of the 10th Anniversary Commemorative Conference, Universities of the Future, Global Aspirations and Local Imperatives is underway. My name is Arya Majumdar. I'm an associate professor here at the JGU Global Law School, also director of admissions, rankings, and academic planning. I would like to extend a warm welcome to each of our panelists. If I could go around the table first to have the panelists introduce themselves. Could I start with Professor Ben Tucker? I just hit that button over there, yeah.
Okay, can you hear me? Right here. Okay, good. So my name is Ben Tucker. I am the founding partner of a company called Minerva. We work all over the world with universities to support capacity development and leadership development. Thank you.
Okay, my name is Paul Flather. I've run a club of European universities for 20 years. I'm a fellow at Oxford. I've actually been involved in higher education off and on for 40 years as a journalist, a politician, built a university and as an academic.
Oh, sorry for that. So I'm a faculty of the law school. I'm also leading the Center for Indian Chinese Studies.
Hi, my name is Ashish. I'm with the youngest school of this university, School of Banking and Finance, and along with Arya, we also look at rankings and benchmarking for this university. Thank you.
I'm Janaki Nair, and I teach history at the Jawaharlal Nehru University.
My name is Srijit SG. I'm the Vice Dean of Jindal Global Law School.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, panelists. What we're going to do is we're going to first go around the panel with a set of questions, and then if there are any follow-up questions within the panel, we can have a second round of discussion, and then open up the house for further debate and deliberation. I'd like to start with Professor Janaki Nair. Professor Nair. Let's give ourselves 10 minutes each, not more than that, because we did start late and I would like to maintain time. I will send you some kind of a notification as and when you're almost about to finish, right? So, Professor Nair, you've had a long, illustrious career, which has led to your position here at JGU. So how do thought leaders like yourself imagine the concept of excellence in higher education, amongst other general comments?
Okay, now would you like me to... I'm sorry. Would you like me to directly answer that? Or in the course of what I have to say, I think you will have some sort of answer. Would that be? Yes, yes. Okay, thank you. First of all, I would like to thank the OP Jindal University for inviting me to this very important event. I'm coming from a university which is celebrating its 50th year. So we have half a century behind us. And I would like to take these few minutes actually to reflect on the role played by the public university. I come from a public university. That's the location I'm coming from, and I would like to thank my colleague. I walked in very late, but I did hear a colleague from Haryana State University mention that the public university is an important space from which such thinking might begin. And I just want to say that we are meeting at a time when the results of the All India Survey on Higher Education have been released. And to take the macro picture, I think there is an achievement of a very high order, because there is an increase in the gross enrollment ratio. As you know, from there is as many as 26.3% of our college-going population between 18 and 23 who are now in higher education, which is a substantial kind of achievement. At 3.7 crores, that is larger than the population of many countries. And the important achievement of that figure is, of course, that there are an equal number of women as men. which is 48.6%. And I think this is another achievement of this country as well. However, having said that, when you look at the details of those figures that IHE has put out, you see that a large number of the new universities are privately owned, and the private university seems to be elbowing out, as it were, the public university. A large number of colleges are running only one program, namely, Bachelor of Education. And there are also these large numbers enrolled in what is described as distance enrollment, which means they don't physically attend a university at all, but they do get some form of credentialing. So I'm starting on a slightly different note, perhaps from what most people accustomed to the private university might take for granted, which is that many of my colleagues worldwide are, of course, declaring, as it were, the slow death of the university as an institutional idea, and that is coming from a very particular analysis of what is happening to the public university. And in particular, the sustained assault on humanities and social sciences, the sustained assault on the university as a center of humane critique. So let me start what I'm going to say by saying there can be no university that does not have a humanities program, and that it cannot be in isolation from other streams. It is to be distinguished, therefore, I think, the university and the public university in particular from technical centers, training institutes, and so on and so forth. So if I can start with a small disagreement, I would rather talk, and I find it more useful to talk in terms of thought worlds rather than talk about thought leaders, because that somehow strikes too close a bell to a form of militarism that is also overtaking our campuses today. Now, if and so I'm actually talking from a very luxurious space, and I should spell this out right at the outset. JNU is one of the most privileged public institutions, but it is instructive precisely because of its reputation and its ranking, particularly in the social sciences, and the enviable place that it has come to enjoy in this very sort of steeply graded hierarchy that we are familiar with today. Its status is, of course, as India's premier research and teaching institution. It enjoys a NAC rating of 3.77, which is A++, for the 5-year period ending in 2018. And it has produced, of course, very large number of PhDs and MPhils. Let me not go into that detail. What I want to say are 4 or 5 things which I see as the hallmark of a university in the true sense of the word, in the sense of in the sense in which I am describing a place like JNU. And I should just mention in passing, since it was raised by the chair of the previous session, that it has been widely acknowledged that JNU contributes a disproportionately large number of research articles and books in the social sciences compared with most other Indian research institutions and universities put together. So, why has such a place, how has such a place been possible? Was it a self-conscious cultivation of rankings right from its establishment? The answer is no. And there are 2 or 3 kinds of elements which I feel have added up to the place that JNU currently occupies today. One, I see the public university as a space of inclusion. And I see this, again affirming my colleagues' words just a few moments ago, as an unavoidable obligation in a country of our kind, which is that it has, JNU in particular, and as a public university, has managed to embrace practically every section of Indian society through a very creative program of admissions. And in some ways, it is living up, therefore, to the ideals which were expressed by people like M.C. Chagla, who, when piloting the bill to bring JNU into existence, said it would be a university of an entirely different type, a new type, a center of excellence. These were the terms that were used. It was envisaged, therefore, as a research universities which would have nothing to take from the 70-odd universities that existed at that time. And I just want to to mention one question which I think should concern us. Whether this university should be a place for the production of distinction alone or become a site for equalizing access. Could these two goals be reconciled? That is the question that I think should interest us. Was a doctoral degree to be a universal right or a restricted privilege? This is the kind of question I feel that it is obligatory to ask in a country like India. So the first element of any university that is, and if I can quote from the founding sort of discussion about JNU, inspired by love and guided by knowledge, the first element of such a university should be the university as a space of autonomy. Now, please remember that at the time that the JNU was set up as a public university, the private university was not even in the dim horizon of, for example, the Radhakrishnan Committee in 1948, which said, we must resist, in the interests of our own democracy, the trend towards governmental domination of the educational process. Higher education is undoubtedly an obligation of the state, but state aid is not to be confused with state control over academic policies and practices. Yes. Oh, it's only 2 minutes? Okay, so I'll rush. I'm saying that it should be cherished and protected as a space of autonomy. And when I say autonomy, I'm not talking of financial autonomy as much as I'm talking of intellectual autonomy. Secondly, it should also be promoted as a space of democratic functioning, in which teachers actually have a large role in deciding the kinds of programs, courses that, and the methods of evaluation that they undertake within the space of the university. Needless to say, that is also accompanied by the university as a space of accountability. I have a long quotation here from somebody who is from our life sciences, but time does not permit me to read this out. I'll simply say that there was a time when JNU actually was an adventure because it established departments that did not exist anywhere else, and the department of the School of Life Sciences was one such. It was an interdisciplinary department. At the time that it was set up, it did not even have a proper laboratory. People were forced, therefore, to engage in all kinds of jugaad, in some ways manage with very little resources. And the publication output at that time exceeds the publication output today, when there is quite a large and substantial grant for equipment and laboratory work. So there is no necessarily relationship between the kind of money you put into a university and the kind of output that is. I'm not valorizing the fact that you have to somehow manage and scringe and scrape and so on and so forth, but I'm simply giving you a historical example to demonstrate that there is something that is beyond the metrics of rankings and so on and so forth, which needs to be thought of or taken into account in order to think of universities as centers of excellence. I'll stop there. I hope I stayed with you.
Thank you very much, Professor Nair. On a lighter note, let not the IOVs that are public institutions hear that. They'll actually not want to take that 1,000 crores that they've been promised. Since there's no, there seems to be very little connection between funding and the research output. I'd like to move to Mr. Ben Tucker right now. Now, Mr. Tucker, you've been engaged with an entity that routinely looks after the hiring challenges of higher education institutions. In your view, what are the major obstacles that thought leaders, such as vice chancellors and directors of higher education institutions, encounter in bringing their vision into praxis?
Okay, thank you very much for having me here today. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I've very much enjoyed listening to the debate so far. Like my colleague, I'll make a few initial observations before coming on to your question, which, from where I sit, has one very clear and specific answer in terms of activities which I think could make the most significant difference in realizing this praxis. I think the first thing is I work with universities all over the world, and I see the same thing happening everywhere, which is, it seems to me that there is a danger that higher education is outsourcing its ownership of what excellence means to the kind of league table industry. Which is based on an assumption that there is only one type of excellence in universities. And I think the thing is that all of us in this room have engaged with enough universities over the periods of our careers and lives to know that that just isn't true. There is no one higher education sector. It is in itself a multiplicity. The purposes of research, teaching, social impact, transforming society, knowledge transfer, are constituted in very different ways in very different places. For example, a university like JNU, which I had the privilege of visiting last month, there I met Professor Bharat Desai, who has become a friend over the years. And it strikes me that he is at least as eminent any professor that I met during my undergraduate time at the University of Oxford. And so I don't know where JNU ranks in the world, but it seems to me that this is an excellent university. And we shouldn't just allow the league tables to tell us what excellence is. And it seems to me also that in asking, I've now spent a number of years working with my colleague, Professor Bamidamari, on some leadership development activities in this country with higher education. And it seems to me that on the basis of the league tables, the question that India should be asking itself is, what kind of universities and what kind of university system will be excellent for India? Whereas actually a lot of the energy seems to be put into asking the question, how does India manufacture universities that the rest of the world deems to be excellent? And it seems to me that the question that you should ask yourself is much more about yourself as a nation. I also think that excellent universities of the future will not look like Harvard. They won't look like Oxford. And I'm not sure that these should be the models that younger universities should be looking at. I think you should be thinking about doing research and translational research in a way which is different and, dare I say, more innovative than some of these older universities. I think you should be thinking about how you make a transformative contribution to students' lives, how you educate them, how you engage with them, and engage with them in the process of their education differently from the way that traditional universities are. So I think it's a whole new area of thinking that really is important for this system in terms of excellence. The final thing, which goes more directly to your question, is it seems to me that with universities I visit all over the world, the leaders of those universities struggle with building capacity and developing staff within institutions. I think the comments from my colleague previously really drew out this question of, can universities be managed? Are universities umbrellas which basically foster individual academics who manage their own franchise? But what we're seeing is, and there are a small number of very privileged universities in the world where this works, but what we're seeing is that for most other universities, in their striving to their own definition of excellence, they need to find new ways of working together. Within the institution, they need to find ways of getting academics to work collaboratively. Going to the comments from Professor Singh at the end of the last session, I would wholly support his argument that there's a huge need for staff development. Even over the past week, Professor Bamidamari and I have been visiting universities in the UP region, and we've seen the same thing repeatedly, which is there is a huge demand in institutions here and all over the world to support people who are at head of department level, who are managing faculty, who are deans, in finding enlightened ways of developing the institution. So I think it's very easy to sit here and pontificate about excellence and talk about the funding that's needed and the ambition that's needed. But actually the reality is is about how you do it, and it's about the system putting much more of its focus on building capacity and leadership, I think. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tucker. Yes, a lot of our Indian universities are modeled on either the Oxford model or the Harvard model. And with the mushrooming of a number of technical universities and centers across India, we've seen how certain systems work, certain systems don't. Of course, it's an ongoing process to rediscover ourselves as a center for higher education. I'd like to move on now to Professor Mark Miller. Professor Miller, I'm so sorry we had to start without you because we were running out of time. So if we could get yourself to introduce yourself, and then a few opening remarks followed by the very specific question that I had for you earlier. And this is really connected to Professor Janki's one of her points as to how thought leaders engage with the question of equity versus excellence. Over to you, Professor Miller.
There we go. So, hello, I'm come from the University of Arizona. I want to talk about, in a few minutes, the response to this idea that equity and excellence are in tension, which is the way the question is framed, and I think that's problematic. But I'd like to begin at least with a minute or two of responding to something Professor Nair said, and one of the underlying questions for I think, for all universities, which is when we talk about the slow death of the university, it's not just a question of the role of the humanities or the social sciences, but fundamentally whether the changes taking place in society are making the university, whether it's the Oxford model or the Harvard model or the University of Arizona or Michigan or Berkeley or whatever model you would like from whatever country you would like, less and less relevant, and whether even when we see amazing institutions like this one coming up in very short order, it is responding to those wins. In the US, for public institutions, the essential problem has been that higher education is no longer viewed as a public good, and whether that will echo in India or elsewhere is a very hard question to say, and I'm not predicting that it will, but if you ask in the US for public institutions, there's been this fundamental transformation, and the challenge is, first, how to survive and thrive, whatever your conception of excellence or history is. And then second, and again, this strikes me as trumping the question of equity versus excellence or definitions of excellence, or are we training students in any discipline for the next 50 years when most of the jobs that exist now won't, and most of the jobs that will exist don't? And are we, with our glass and steel and brick structures, thinking through and preparing students across disciplines for that world? On the question of equity versus excellence, I think that is an issue that any and every institution faces, no matter how elite, no matter how well-funded, and no matter how old. But I think it is a terrible question if you think of it only in terms of any individual institution. It is a question for institutions, for systems, for states, if they have regulatory power, for countries. It has to be framed at the bottom level. And I've heard today in the conversations people referencing that, talking about the broader challenges. There are some really interesting experiments going on. There's some really interesting experiments going on that take on our traditional conceptions of equity versus excellence. Some of them are digital. I mean, it's happening in lots of domains, but let me point to one, and not one at my own at my own university. And that is what Rutgers University in New Jersey has done with its honors college. And if you haven't followed this, it's a story worth following. The conception of honors colleges at most US universities, public and private, but certainly at the publics, which I know well, is that this is a school within a school. It'll be more like a traditional liberal arts college. It will be smaller classes. It will be for students with more elite entrance scores. What Rutgers has done is said that what an honors college should be is a college for leaders, going to one of the themes of the earlier panel. And so they admit, without looking, or at least without heavily weighting test scores, they look instead at illustrations of grit, of what challenges students have overcome in their lifetime, personal, community, family, or otherwise. And they take the strongest group in terms of their measure of grit and then put in the kind of extra resources that public universities in the US commit to honors colleges to make sure they graduate at very high levels and succeed. It's one small illustration, but it blows through the traditional idea that there's some trade-off necessarily between access or equity and excellence, because it redefines excellence in a university setting. I might add as well that for the public institutions in the US, not every one of them, put aside Berkeley and Michigan and Virginia, which in effect hasn't been a public institution for many years, but for the multitude of very good, large, I mean, U of A, $2.5 billion a year budget, about $800 million in research, 45,000 students, pretty big, pretty vibrant place. But in terms of access, it is not hard to be admitted as an undergraduate to the University of Arizona or to Arizona State University or to Michigan State University or to any number of very good, very well-funded state universities. The challenge, therefore, on equity, not versus excellence, is how do you take students who often aren't as strong, don't have the same background, and help them to succeed at similar higher rates? How do you make sure they're fully integrated along with students who we think of in more traditional terms of as elite? You want those students to, why? Because they help internally in terms of both internal education, mentoring, thought leadership, research, and so forth. So I point to the Rutgers example only because it's so counter to our assumption of what an honors college is at most places. But I think it's illustrative of a much larger conversation about how we teach, who we teach, and when we teach, which does not lay out on the equity excellence division. I want to be attentive to the time. I look forward to questions. As is true for all of us, I think there's much more to say. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Professor Miller. I'm now going to move on very quickly to Dean Bharadwaj. Ashish, we've been a thought leader for quite a while now, leading JGU into the World University Rankings and the Institution of Eminence. But these must have come from local aspirations that we've had as a privately funded social science university in Haryana. So after your initial thoughts and initial comments, if you could address what are the ways in which thought leaders can translate their local aspirations into global eminence.
Sure, thanks, Arya. Just like the previous speakers, I'm going to, I have some opening remarks. And I'm glad that Professor Nair talked about, started with a disagreement, because I'm going to build on that. I want us to take a step back, and I want us to understand, let's say, the distinction between thought leaders and public intellectuals. And why do we need them, which one do we need more, and so on. That touches upon the question which Ben also asked, what kind of universities should we be building, right, in India? So in my understanding, when academics intervene in the marketplace for ideas, they do so as very traditional public intellectuals, where they try to explain why a certain law or a policy or even some kind of a discourse may not work at all, rather than as thought leaders who have some positive idea of change and some kind of conviction that they can bring about a difference. So what we probably need are thoughtful intellectuals, now more than at any other time, at least in India. So we need we need a blend of these thoughtful leaders rather than thought leadership and public intellectuals, where one side is the bold, creative side without which we will never really have ideas devised or proposed. And on the other side, we have the critical, questioning, careful side of an intellectual, without which we will never have those ideas tested or refined in the first place. So I feel that the idea of thought leadership to a large extent is at odds with the idea of being a public intellectual. I also feel that that's what institutions like JNU, that's what institutions like OP Jindal, Global University, are trying to do, to build, to create public intellectuals in any field, in politics, in history, in law, in economics, policy making in general, through their ideas and scholarships rather than leading a certain train of thought. I'll stop here, and I hope we can bring this up in the discussion. That was brief. Thanks.
All right, Ashish, that was rather quick. Very good. I'm going to move to Professor Srijit now. Professor Srijit, you're the Vice Dean of one of our most successful schools, the Jindal Global Law School. On a similar vein of local versus global, and this really, goes to the heart of our overall panel discussion as to dealing with what is excellence. Amongst the various aspects of excellence that we have, what are the local imperatives and leadership in higher education that we should be focusing on in order to achieve global excellence?
Thank you, Arya. So I've tried to understand local imperatives within a larger conceptualization of excellence. I'm not going to waste much of the time explaining in what way the concept of excellence can be articulated, but rather I would say that it's a move from, particular to a much more universal framework. So I would say here the parochialism of particular to a much more altruistic general. So in some, excellence is in fact transcending the particular to move to a much more universal framework. But when I talk about the local, I do not associate local with the particular. I talk about local is not a world of parochial. I would rather say that local is a world of specialities which are quite often ignored in the larger scheme of things. So within that framework, I would pose this question that should pursuit of excellence be imitation or imagination? And in pursuit of local imperatives, I would rather prefer an imagination, or rather a reimagination of the local imperatives, or reimagination of the concept of excellence. But before that, I would also say that excellence is most often not something to which institutions climax into, but rather excellence is often something that we encounter on the path towards a self-perfection. After all, what's the point in reaching excellence all worn out and tired that you cannot even revel in the glory of the excellence you have achieved? So when it comes to local aspirations, I would say that here it's all about the fullness of the self. It's all about the lightness of the being, or even about the luminosity of the mind. Within the larger scheme of things, and we have also decided that we'll be focusing more on reimagination of the concept of excellence so that local imperatives get a space. I would say that excellence is not exactly what the excellent does, but probably it is to gain a comparative advantage rather than more focusing on the situational advantage. So I would rather say that a school in the periphery, which is catering to education to the underprivileged, or which is providing education to the underprivileged, enabling them to participate in the larger social production, is indeed on the path towards excellence. So here, the community getting a representation in the larger scheme of excellence is the very sign that the law school is on, or the school is on the march towards excellence. Second one, the larger satisfaction of the participants and the stakeholders. Here you need not look at the sphere within which the participation or the stakes are vested, but rather it's about, how contentment, what sort of a contentment, what sort of a trust, ecosystem of trust and confidence the school has been able to generate. That is one of the local imperative which is often overlooked by in pursuit of this larger level of excellence. The third point, I would typically speak from a law school's perspective, it's that the law deans are generally conflictually torn between being a rainmaker or being what I would call it an embattled juggler who had to deal with routine things. So in this case, the student view the dean as the god of small things, and vice dean particularly as an agent of the god. Lot of energy, time, have been invested in dealing with the routine things in order to create what you call an ecosystem of trust. And this is in fact, such a robust ecosystem is a result of an administrative sensitivity on the part of the thought leader here or on the part of the leader here. So in pursuit of these bigger things, often these small things which often make a bigger impact are ignored. So this local aspiration means the energy and the time invested at the local level absolutely has been overlooked in the larger scheme of things. So in fact, a thought leader, when in action, puts in creating an ecosystem of trust. The energy and the time puts in creating an ecosystem of trust has often been ignored. Now, when it comes to the broader parameters of excellence, one way to overcome, how to accommodate these local concerns in this larger scheme of excellence is that in order to be too specific about what amounts to excellence, we can always create this larger parameters of excellence. Say, for example, who has been taught? Instead of asking, has the school excelled in teaching and research, the appropriate questions could be, who has been taught? What level of people have been enabled through education? Has the research achieved the social outcomes rather than more hits and citations? When it comes to partnerships and collaborations, it's not the magnitude of the partnerships and collaborations that matter, but has the community or the planet in question got an advancement in the larger scheme of things? Has there been an appreciation of the collaborations and partnerships at the subspaces, which I would call the periphery here, which is in fact the local? So, for example, creation of a robust system whereby which is purely run in ethical lines and with high level of objectivity and fairness. Can that system be appreciated in the larger scheme of things? When I say the larger scheme of things, I'm specifically referring to the manner in which excellence is conceived by the ranking agencies. To sum up, I would advocate for a case for broad parameters of excellence so that the particular concerns of the local can be incorporated in that. And for that, what we really need is to create more imaginative spaces when interpreting the concept of excellence. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Srijit. I think you've brought out a very, very important aspect of this discussion, which is when we're caught up in research productivity and output, and we're looking at our H indexes, we often forget the lives that we have the potential to change while working within our local communities. Dr. Paul Flather, over to you. You've been a former Secretary General of the European, and we've been talking about earlier how Indian universities or the Indian university system need not be an imitation of Harvard or Oxford. Within that context, if you could enlighten us on the lessons that Indian leadership in higher education could learn from leaders in world-class universities across the world.
Okay, well, thank you very much. As others, I'm delighted to be here. I've actually watched the university grow, and you can literally see it as you walk around the campus because it was flat and dull, and there was hardly even lawn, to echo some previous speaker, and now there are bushes and trees. But I also want to just say that I hesitate to answer your question. I'm going to do it because the last time I spoke here, I had to give 2 lectures on explaining Brexit to an Indian audience, and this is actually a piece of cake, given that. But I want to do it, I want to hesitate because I want to do it with humility, and I also want to respect all the other marvelous points that have been made. I do think there are tensions. And I do think that it's not a question of imitating or copying. It's about developing your own ideas within a cultural context about what excellence is. But then let me lob in 3 or 4 ideas that struck me that might be useful. The first of all is, what kind of thought leader? Now, universities have traditionally always selected a superb academic as its leader. That's obvious. Academics who are superb know how to be superb, and therefore they ought to be able to recreate the conditions for other superb work. Moreover, they're respected by their colleagues and they're respected by outsiders. But an interesting study in the UK recently found out that over a 10-year period, the number of academics increased by 10%, the number of students by 9%, but the number of managers by 33%. So what I want to suggest to you is, and I think we all do this, so I'm not telling anything that's fresh, I'm simply underlying some points, is that the superb academic must also these days be a decent, if not good, if not superb manager. And that's reflected in changes that are sweeping across Europe. And that is that previously, Britain was always an outlier and always in front and a little bit in line with America. Previously, the leader of institutions, presidents, vice-chancellors, were elected by the university. And that meant they automatically gravitated towards a nice person, a nice woman, man, who was also a superb academic. Now there are selection boards, and even in Germany, which has learned the lessons very quickly, France hasn't learned these lessons, and French universities, you might argue, are doing less well. Number two, so I'm trying to introduce this idea that we're looking for a wider thought leader. Number two, mission. Look, everybody agrees the university has a very complex and wide-ranging mission, but there is one thing that matters. Put students first. You've been saying, many of your colleagues have been saying this. Let me just emphasize it again. Put students first. That's what matters. Now, there was a survey by my colleagues at the Higher Education Policy Institute I work with, which looked at students across 20 universities in Britain, and they found that the highest student satisfaction was at Oxford and Cambridge, the lowest dropout, the most satisfaction with the courses, and the most satisfaction with outcomes. I'm not wanting to boast about Oxford. All I want to tell you is that one of the reasons why it's an excellent university is because it delivers what students appear to want, okay? It's a circular thing. We can analyze why and wherefore and so on and so forth. But very interesting for us, students at Oxford and Cambridge work hardest. They do 43 hours. This is a huge statistical longitudinal survey. They work 43 hours a week. The average at other universities is under 30, okay? So why do they work? Because they're inspired. I mean, like JNU, wonderful university. They're inspired, they have good teachers and so on. So it's circular, but there is a lesson there about what we want to talk about. Number three, governance style. And I think the previous chair, Pritam Singh, picked this up quite well. I'll just, can I get this out? You know, universities, they've become quite centralized, partly because they become business-orientated. So there's lots of insiders and outsiders. The insiders sit on executive committees, they know what's going on, they probably do less research. And the outsiders, the good people, your public intellectuals probably, don't really know what's going on. And in British universities, you have governing bodies with lay outsiders who are supposed to do the accountability bit, which we all agree is important. But they don't know what the heck's going on at all. They just get reports on the day, and they just have to comment on it, and they know nothing about it. So I think what's very important, and this is a lesson, we call it in Oxford and Cambridge collegiality. Inclusion, involvement. One of the colleagues made this point about JNU, not surprising, because Raj and Sudarshan and others are all products of this system, and they enjoyed it. Inclusion and involvement. And you get correction, you get comment, you get improvement. It makes sense. I have one more point, but let's leave it.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Flather. It is true that most thought leaders are in higher education are undoubtedly academicians, are very, very good academicians. But what you seem to suggest is that thought leaders should have some scope or some inspiration or aspiration for actual leadership or management as such. I'd like to move to Professor Wenjuan, our last speaker for this panel, and continue on the same vein in terms of learning from each other. If the ranking tables are any measure of excellence, and that too is a highly debatable question, Chinese universities have been doing rather well compared to Indian. Does that therefore mean that Indian universities have a lot to learn from Chinese universities? And if so, what are the measures of excellence that we may be inspired to follow as well?
Thank you. So actually, while many colleagues are talking about this topic, I'm also keep reflecting on the Chinese experience. And actually, some colleagues also refer to Chinese experience. I think for the world-class university excellence, it's not a white and black. So you need lots of dilemmas there, actually. You need to balance. So I think this is also the lessons from the Chinese experience. For example, you need to think about how to set the minimum standard, right? And also you need to have the autonomy of education innovation. What is the minimum standard? Then sometimes sometimes maybe it's become a binding rule for all the universities, whether it's how to define minimum. And second, I think also, the competition is not just among universities, also among countries, right, for knowledge country or something. So you have the incentive to create a world-class universities to have a flagship like the country. But meanwhile, you also need to think about you have limited resources. You have how to improve the general standard. So that's the country also need to balance. And then finally, even for teachers' assessment, you also, if you set some standard, you need to balance teaching and publication. For example, China is more objective. So publication is a very hard indicator, right? And then the teachers have more preference to publication, not for teaching. So that's another big challenge. So I think there's three dilemmas. So if I come back to Chinese, like the world-class university building or something, I see the first caricature is, if you talk about leadership, I think it's a state leadership. The state set up all this kind of, it's a game, like a competition, right? And then use the leverage of promotion, because the Chinese university, the majority of public universities, they're very, very few, and even the very few never can be the top tier even. So all these public university compete for excellence. So the state set the criteria for competition, and all of them need to promotion for the presidents, right? So they join the game. And then in terms of how to set up this scheme, the first is, I think, China follow this objective assessment. So because in China, whenever they have subjective, there's abuse, always abuse, So for people, all for the fairness, this objective, like how many on the SSCI publications, how many on CSSCI, and how about the impact indicator, all this counting in, and then ranking the people, ranking the faculty, ranking the university, ranking the city. So now the competition is not just among the teachers, but also among the universities and also among cities. I can give you an example, like Duke University, they want to have a campus in China. And then Shanghai, the city of Shanghai, and there's another small city close to Shanghai, it's called Kunshan. So they compete, right? Shanghai is a big city, they need to go some procedure. And then the mayor of the Kunshan city directly fly to Duke, and they say, whatever you need, let's have a negotiation, just sign the MOU on site. So then others cannot compete. So why the cities need to compete on this? Because the no knowledge economy, right? If you don't have an excellent university, the city cannot develop very well. So now that there's a heated competition among cities to get best university, they promise to give free land, give you academic freedom, and this or that. So try to, the competition among faculty also very sharp. They have a 1,000 talents program, and they also young scholar, and every city even they have. If you go into this this program, you get, of course, the faculty have a privilege, and also how many these scholars in your university, then they rank the university, right? And then how many universities in this city, they rank the city. So that makes a very sophisticated competition mechanism have been set in China. So what's the consequences, right? So the consequences is, and then of course improve the quality generally, and then improve the quality, but it's also create a big inequality, very big inequality. Because China, you have heard like a 911, 211, 985, or a double world class, double first class, all this. If you go into this program, you have bunch of money, right? Lots of money, even they don't know how to spend. But for the marginalized small university, they never have the chance. So there's a big gap, and very much like the Chinese poverty reduction. So we always see we have lifted 700 million people out of production, out of poverty. But meanwhile, we also have one of the highest Gini, coefficient in the world. So that's the exact same for the universities. We have many top world-class universities now, but we also have many universities so marginalized. The top universities, they have the world-class library, world-class faculty, so many. I can give you like Shanghai Jiao Tong University, even not Peking or Tsinghua. The students have enough. They don't know how to use it to go abroad, full scholarship, this or that. But for the small universities, the marginalized, they never have the chance. They even don't have a very good, faculty. So that's just the reality. And I think my time might be, so I also thinking, in terms of, there's another two things. Maybe we can count it in the visionary part. And then one is how to link what's the response of university to social demand. I think today there's a lack of reflection, actually. The elite disconnection with the general public reflecting in the politics now, it should be the reflection for the universities, I think most of the time they are treated them too elite, not closely connected with the social demand of the general public. I think that's one thing we need to reflect on. And the second, also how to link it today and future. I think AI, nobody can stop it. It's coming. So we will co-living, with these robots or something, this artificial intelligence, and how to deal with this, right? How to prepare for this future. Of course, there are some discussions, but I think there's very little practical actions have been taken. So I'll just stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Wenjuan. Thank you very much, panelists. We've got about 15 to 20 minutes till the end of this session. I'd like to kickstart this part of this panel by posing a couple of difficult, if not provocative, questions. For a higher education institution, what does it mean to be excellent? I think we can all agree, given the discussions that have taken place today, that excellence must mean different things in different contexts. It cannot just be the number of papers your faculty have published in Nature and Science. It cannot just be the number of citations that they've received. It cannot just be the number of impoverished students that you've brought out of poverty. It cannot just be having 3 conference rooms that are centrally air-conditioned. Right? So we can all agree that excellence must differ depending upon the context. Here's my question. In spite of that, could we possibly have an objective measure of excellence? I'll leave it to the participants. One option that I see, to begin with, is a very astute observation. Put students first. And that really strikes at the heart of the role that the university plays, whether it's private, whether it's public university. At the heart of it all is the student. If you could begin this discussion from there.
What's the distribution of the salary structure? I mean, these are very important measures, but I think they don't undermine your first point. To set up a university with those solely as a measure would be hard. I think if you follow it in the US under the Obama administration, there was an effort to add on, in essence, a national return on value metric of universities. And there was a lot of controversy over, and it didn't go very far. But it was an effort to do precisely that. Which universities are having the biggest impact for the students who go there? So,, it, you know, those efforts are out there and they can be examined.
I mean, I'll say that in order to have a framework which can promote, sustain excellence, there has to be a very thorough focus and a genuine interest in retaining academic freedom and autonomy at the very first step, although this is probably more relevant for faculty and faculty members and researchers, but then it is going to trickle down to students. And then hopefully we are going to see some kind of excellence coming out of that institutional process. It also needs to involve promoting academic conversations which are as important as talking about employability and how the students might perform when they join the industry or when they graduate. And then, as Srijit was saying, a very strong ecosystem of trust which needs to be instilled not just among faculty but also students. That could be one way to go about understanding excellence.
All right. So we have one model which is actually used in the global MBA rankings, which is what was your salary pre-MBA and what's your salary post-MBA, and that sort of becomes the measure of the value of that higher education or excellence. But Ashish, you're suggesting that academic freedom and collaborations between academics eventually does trickle down to great teaching, perhaps, right, to our students, and it hopefully changes their lives. Any other comments of that? Yeah, Mr. Taka?
So I think we have to resist a singular answer to that question. I think we have to keep coming back to that. I think that the put students first is a huge change which is happening in sectors all over the world. And it's an exciting change, I think. But it would also be crazy to have a complete pendulum swing. And, we say research doesn't matter anymore. We don't care how many papers are being published. I think, the sector has multiple purposes. And I think what we're seeing is a rebalancing towards the student away from the singular emphasis on research. We're seeing maybe a more holistic picture of it. But I think we need to accept that there is ambiguity. It's a complicated sector, and let's celebrate that.
Okay, it was my notion, and in a sense, I said put students first. It doesn't mean put students first alone. So I hesitated about answering you straight away, Mr. Chairman, but I agree with Ben. I mean, it's not just that there are multiple objectives and multiple definitions and multiple aims, but here's the point. We need all those aims to be successful to put students first. In other words, we need to have good research. We need to have, good facilities. We need to have exciting innovation and so on, because that is all part of the student experience. But on the other hand, let's not imagine, as used to happen, that universities were for professors or to lead stable lives and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I just want to say something that might sound a little startling, but I'll say it anyway, which is that, I had the good fortune of living and teaching in the United States, and it always struck me that there was a very high level of mediocrity. And then it occurred to me the reason for that is because so many people are going into higher education. They have a gross enrollment ratio of well over 50%, if I'm not mistaken, which is double what is in India. So when you support large numbers going in, the chances of people actually achieving excellence is much greater. Because I think the real brain drain in countries like ours is that some people simply do not get an opportunity to go to higher education institutions. Having said that, I also want to say it was wonderful to hear the Chinese example, because in some ways she underlined what I was saying about the importance of public universities in situations like ours. And I say this because, and this is a problem which probably no university system represented around this table faces, which is that in India, all our higher education is in English. And even a place like JGU, I would say, has failed in this mission of making higher education available in languages that are meaningful to larger numbers of people. Unless we address the question of language as well, we will simply be excluding. I mean, we are going to be excluding a lot of people who do extremely important and creative thinking in other languages.
Just a quick point. I would like to build on that ecosystem of trust and confidence. I would say that there should also be an ecosystem of happiness. So the fundamental question we ask is there a happy law schooling happening here? Because we find that the students are in a deep crisis of representation. So they're actually looking for spaces where they can explore their own identities. So whether the law school creates such dialectic spaces whereby they can challenge, debate, and contest themselves. So I think it's also about the creation of such kind of dialectic spaces that the contentment factor, the happiness factor among the students lie.
I'm now going to open the floor up for any questions. I recognize 3 hands up over there. Can someone pass on a mic, please?
Okay.
Right.
Me again, sorry about that. Now, Bamrimare, just a couple of points, if I may, Mr. Chairman. Allow me to challenge this whole discussion. There is no excellence that is not defined. Excellence is unbounded. It's a constant strive towards continuous improvement to whatever that may be, perfection, unseen, unattainable almost, perfection. So excellence is a journey, not actually a destination. That's one thing. The second thing is the students first. There seems to be an implicit assumption in the discussion that putting students first means the focus is teaching and learning. Far from it. Fantastic research is putting students first. Fantastic enterprise is putting students first. So the student first should not be misunderstood. That is actually the crux of the education process, students first. But these are all as important as teaching and learning.
Yeah. Hello. I think your question was like, can there be some objective benchmarks, objective measurements where we can measure excellence? Well, excellence is an abstract notion, like it cannot be measured as such. But I think I can offer 2 ways to measure it. And that's in my context. Again, I'll reiterate what I said in the beginning, that like state universities and the areas where they operate, like the kind of impact which universities make on the local community and the kind of participation they ensure of the local community, the context in which they operate. Like that could be one of the areas where something can be done. And in my university, which is Bhagat Phool Singh Mahila Vishwavidyalaya, we have created a Center for Society-University Interface, CSUIR, where local community is engaged in our day-to-day activities. There are academic courses for them. As Professor Nair said, that the language is a problem. Like we ensure that their language comes into picture and becomes the medium of instruction, medium of education for them. So that's one. Second is, like one of the areas could be, like, can a university provide access to maximum number of students? Like, again, as far as, I may sound blunt, but as far as private universities are concerned, how many students from like medium class families or lower middle class do you find in those universities, right? So excellence becomes somewhat an elite term kind of thing, right? I think, so it's not a generic term as such. Thank you.
I was drawing your attention.
Okay, so one of the things that has been said about the thought leaders, and my question is, like, can we have academic freedom and autonomy, which has been the focus or which has been reiterated again and again, within the classroom, and yet constrict other kinds of freedom outside the classroom for faculty? And then, say, participation in how the university actually operates. Within my classroom, I'm totally free. Outside the classroom, do I have a say? And say, what kind of students get selected within the university? So does that have any impact on the excellence, the way we are looking at excellence? Because faculty becomes the key to excellence, as I understand from this. Even if it is student first, the student first has to be done by faculty members. It's not just the top leadership, say VC and the deans. There has to be more beyond that. What's your take on that?
Let me just reflect on that a little bit, Deepak. I think the notion of the disengagement between a faculty and a thought leader is one that can be challenged. That a thought leader should, in higher education, should first and foremost be an academic. The problem that I think what we're trying to draw our attention to is that once you're a thought leader, do you cease to be an academic? Now, an argument could be made that you're an academic by choice, by calling, right? And as an academic, if I'm to become a thought leader, that one part of me will still remain. Another aspect of your point, I think, was that as a faculty member, do I get included in the decision-making process? Was that the crux of it, right? Well, that is where I think the university ecosystem comes into play, right? And there are, as we've discussed today, there's plenty of models to choose from, each with its benefits, each with its flaws. Could we have a more inclusive leadership process which involves more faculty, right? It is entirely possible, but there was one mention of a university in the previous panel where their academic council ran into, I think, 300 odd members. Now, at what stage do you say that, no, okay, too much inclusion is a bad thing, right? But we'll move on. We have time for a couple of other questions. We'll go with Professor Stephen Marks first.
I wasn't going to intervene, but I can't resist, and I want to thank Jenica for stimulating this thought. As we reflect on the meaning of conceptualizing excellence, here's the thought that I haven't heard yet that occurs to me from my own experience. Along with the objective criteria that we can identify and put on lists and so on, there's a sort of a subjective one that for students and for faculty, one of the features of the university environment that moves one from mediocrity to excellence is emulation. So a student who comes into a university not knowing what the hell this is all about observes those who are really doing something interesting, really thinking things through for the first time, new ideas, reconceptualizing how they're going to approach their family, their lives, and so on. Faculty come in. They wanted a job. They got their PhD. They've got the job. They can see other faculty who are really doing something exciting, new ideas, and so on. So for me, hearing this discussion, conceptualizing excellence also includes this idea of emulation. You cannot have a clue what it is either as a student or as a faculty member. But in the setting, you acquire a sense of excellence because you go beyond what you were. And that, I think, is one of the features that makes a university an exciting place, and a place that, by this amorphous definition, can achieve excellence.
Yes, thank you. It's just stimulated me because I wanted to ask a question of Professor Zhang, because there's been a lot of criticism of Chinese universities for having tried to copy Western models centrally. In other words, the parties decided that the Chinese universities must be better, so they must have more publications in peer-reviewed journals, they must have better laboratories, they must have more star professors, they are given huge amounts of extra funding and scholarships and traveling abroad and so on. But the criticism is that, of course, the universities have improved enormously, and we can see that in the Chinese students that pack into Western universities. Oxford is absolutely teeming with Chinese students. I mean, 1 in 7, 1 in 8, and they're very bright, and they actually, their language skills are superb, and they're just superb. But there's nothing special or distinctive about it. So going back to the earlier point that I think we've made, I mean, it's just a little challenge, because I don't think I'll ever have this chance again, and you've raised this question. I mean, do you think that, in a sense, China's missing out on something, because it's not allowing itself its own peer review process of emulation, to pick up Stephen's point, to produce something distinctive which might be valuable globally?
I mean, in terms of modernization for China, right, it's really from the Opium War and then really look to the West to learn how to improve themselves. You can see even the economic model, Chinese business styles, all is like emulation, right? Learning. But after, I think after a certain period of time, so when they have enough experience, and they may have some, a little bit, but I think that I didn't mention in my last comment, I mean, so they have the centralized political leadership, but they give Chinese universities actually lots of administrative autonomy and financial autonomy. I think compared to Indian public universities, Chinese universities have much more autonomy in terms of administration and finance. So this also make them have their space to some extent. You can see that now Chinese university style a little bit different. They try to see their identity, but I completely agree with you. All these top, they try to emulate both the faculty and the students, and even, but the management style, the governance is a little bit different. So that's, yeah.
I know we're running late for lunch, and I'm sure everyone's hungry, but I seek the indulgence of this audience for one last question from Professor Pankaj Gupta.
Okay. Thank you. I'd just like to add one very small component here. One is the part of the emulation. But those emulations cannot create newness. There can be, one small improvement here and there. But the biggest innovations are only coming from out of nothing. And also there are some other points, like the people have been like secure leaders, they are restful, inner focused, and the people who are in a position to co-create value. Because most of these things are coming from a domain of that I don't know, that I don't know. And from there, a lot of newness and those things happen. So that is my first point. And secondly, for the excellence model, one of my mentors suggested, like the way we do prayer or puja or namaz, so at that time our attention is totally there. If we are able to create a culture by which we are doing our job like a puja and with a bigger purpose in mind, that my job, how it is impacting the universe and all that, and if we are able to create that zest in the whole system, I think on its own we'll be moving towards excellence. So these 2 points. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pankaj. Thank you very much, panelists. Thank you very much, audience. If you could join me in giving a round of applause to our speakers this session. It's been wonderful. And I'd say that's lunch, and my colleagues will... Yeah, right, so one lunch announcement.
So yeah, lunch is laid at T1 Adda. Our volunteers will guide you towards that. And we will reassemble here at 2:45 for our third panel discussion. Thank you very much.